Tech Insiders Podcast, episode 28. We're going to talk about the US distributors versus Provi. We're going to talk about a fraud solution, a follow-up to a previous podcast. Maybe glass will be reduced or be gone from wine bottles. Is this a disaster? What's going on? Or is this the future? And a big DTC, well, a significant DTC merger. Is there something in the water? Is something going on? Back are our insiders, Laurie from Oushinery.
Hi.
Seb from Troly.
Good morning, boys and girls.
And Jonathan from Bottlebooks.
Hey, everyone.
All right, let's start with the death of the glass bottle. Prices are increasing in glass bottles in the US. They've risen as much as 20%, and sustainability is coming into play. Glass bottles are heavier and therefore more expensive and more energy, climate consuming to ship around the world. I know in Bottlebooks, a number of events, actually almost every event we're doing has some kind of sustainability angle. We've oriented our events catalogs to really highlight this, to be optimized for sustainability. Jonathan, tell us what you think. Are we going to be seeing less glass?
I think absolutely. I think the acceptance is growing in alternative packaging, and the thing that always drives acceptance is your pocketbook. As well. So if your favorite product starts getting more expensive and there's a cheaper way to enjoy it, that's what gets people to shift, at least in the main area. I mean, you're still going to have different perspectives probably on premium wines, but for everyday drinker commercial wines, I think it's very likely to shift. I think it's also notable when you see writers like Jancis Robinson calling out. So California had a recent event where they put the bottle weights also on in the website, and Jancis Robinson called that out in her Financial Times article last weekend, and so I think that hasn't been something that's been highlighted before, and they got some great press out of it, and so that might encourage some other people to follow.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because, like, in the world of wine, obviously, like sustainability, carbon footprint, in the eye of the consumer and the industry, we often think of the wine growing, the wine making, because that's the part that we think of when we think of wine. Like, it's very easy to almost skip mentally the packaging, but I think it's coming, right? Like, to just be like more like, I can even see, not that we need yet another icon or logo or badge on the packaging, but like, hey, this is, this wine is bottled in a container that is less detrimental to the environment or has a lower carbon footprint than a typical. I'm really curious about that. Like, it's almost like the missing element, like the winemaking, wine growing, that's more and more like accepted. Salmon safe and all of that, super important. But what's really interesting is, like, I was looking at studies, and about half of the wine bottle's carbon footprint is the packaging and this shipping around of the packaging back and forth. So it's just such an opportunity to walk the talk all the way. Obviously, there's a lot of romanticization. Like, wine is wine bottle. I mean, it used to be in amphoras, and we used to be okay with it, right? Like, it evolves. Like, nothing has to be like fully static. On our Oushinery side, like, we're seeing more cans, wine in cans, more and more bag in a box, like we have discussed before, which is more predominant originally like in the Scandinavian market. So we're starting to see it more and more in the US, and not necessarily like cheap wine. Of course, it's usually like more on the affordable, like bracket. We're not putting like, super pricey wine in it, but really more and more. And also we're starting to see, I think it's a bit more novel, is like this aluminum can, the one that is just like lightweight. They look more, that they don't look like a wine can, like maybe like between an hybrid between like almost like a swell bottle, like this water drinking bottle that you see like people like walking around everywhere, but smaller version, recyclable, and to hold wine. So it looks a bit more elevated than a beer can in the space. So that's something we've been noticing quite a bit.
I think it's a really interesting topic because you both have touched a few interesting points, namely how traditional the world of wine is. I am amongst the believers that we're not doing nearly enough as an industry to target, to attract, to communicate, to sell to the newer generations, the new crowds, hence the new packaging. I'm not convinced, like on the overall sustainability front, glass is still very well recycled versus the Tetra Paks and the everything else. And the weight of the bottle, the weight of the glass as a component of the weight of the overall bottle, Laurie, you mentioned 50%. I'm not sure that packaging is 50% because the liquid is actually still really heavy, even if it's packaged in a plastic bag.
Oh, but keep in mind that the bottle moves more, right? That is a total life. Like the bottle needs to go from empty from the glass manufacturer to I think that's the whole.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair point.
I think that's the whole thing. One thing we know, for example, as a designer and even as a, Oushinery, silk screen bottle, where the design is directly applied on the glass. Really cool. Like it's cool looking. It's like a unique factor and it's like capable of a lot of things. But I've seen a couple of wineries actually stepping away from it because it requires even more transport of glass. Because not only does the glass goes often to the winery, then it goes to the silk screen people, then it goes back. So it's even more like transport. So I think the carbon footprint of the movement of that bottle is from the manufacturer all the way to the it moves a lot. Look, even empty, that's one we forget. It's very easy to forget that even that is the part of it.
Look, it's interesting because we have a winery we're working with in Oregon, and they have actually launched a bring your own bottle or bring back your bottles plan. So as a member, you get your 12 bottles shipped, and then if you bring your 12 bottles back, they're going to give you a discount, a bit of a deposit kind of a scheme. And so ultimately, that's one way of trying to have the traditional bottle shape, keep the bottle, reduce your costs, which I thought was marketing-wise very interesting, right? Everyone is aware that sustainability is a topic. Hey, club members, instead of just throwing them in the bin or in the recycling box, why don't you just bring them back when you next come and visit? And they clean them and they reuse them.
Well, I think that's something that's been going on for like in Italy for ages. Like if you're like a restaurant, you'll come into the local winery, bring in your jug, and it's basically like the fuel nozzle that you
like a growler.
You take it, you pull it off the wall, you stick it in the container, pump it full of 5 or 10 liters of whatever you're needing to do. You pay for how much you pumped, and then you take it with you to the restaurant.
So much for romanticism.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just part of the daily life in Italy, right? I mean, you always have wine on the table, and the everyday drinkers are even really great, right? In another discussion recently with a retailer that is integrating our software into another one of their systems. It's a different team, and one of the questions they came to us with was, do you have a question on Bottlebooks to capture data on returnable bottles?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, this is going to sound really weird, but that's a really novel question. We've never heard that before in any sort of wine discussion, but to have the question in the system say it's a returnable bottle. I said, well, you might want to check to see how that actually works in your geography, because I'm not certain that we're that far on wines, but the fact that is even coming up and we're thinking seriously about it, I think it's also a sign of the times that we are actually like, it is possible to return a bottle.
Yeah, correct. And look, I think overall, Jonathan, you mentioned the overall price of the glass affecting the price of the product. And I think when you're looking at the greater sort of a food industry, when you're looking at everything that's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and fertilizer cost and growing cost, there is no doubt that the prices of wines will be going up in the next 12, 18 months. How quickly and how much very much depends on everyone's individual strategies. But I think we're all going to start paying a bit more, especially given it's a luxury good. So I don't think the glass in itself is going to be the only factor in having a slightly higher price. And I don't know how much of a discount we would be able to get as a consumer if it's packaged slightly differently. Because the value the value of the glass itself, how much is the producer going to save? I think it's minimal.
And also, like, there's this extra cost. The filling bottling line may be like the truck rolling in, or the physical bottling line. If it's a bigger winery, they don't fill, like, unless they rechange like the machinery and things like that I'm not aware of. But like filling a can or filling a bag in a box is very different from filling, a glass bottle. So it's also like not that easy to necessarily implement for wineries. Like, there is like the risk, and also like literally the logistics of like making it happen. We're seeing, again, like with Oushinery, like some like co-packers specializing, trying to like provide like that service like for wineries, like especially like like cans with lining and like the pressure control and all that jazz. But it's also like there's potentially even like an investment on something that is not necessarily like going to bring down to cost, and not something that has been fully validated by the market yet. So I can also see that like slowing the adoption, not like the pocketbook at the end of the day, like, okay, how much? Yeah, that's just very interesting. It's complicated on the application, like making it happen.
I think cans speak to the newer generations and the on-the-go kind of consumptions. And cans are fairly lightweight. They're also fairly well recycled. So I think, it's a shame that the industry is not adopting them as fast as we probably should.
Great. Let's move on to a big lawsuit in the US. This is between Provi, who we covered in a previous episode. They provide a technology, a website essentially, where you can, if you're a restaurant, you can order wines from your distributor and get them, wines or spirits or whatever you want. And you can order them conveniently in an app. Southern Glazer and RNDC sent their customers emails saying that they will no longer fulfill orders through Provi, and so Provi is suing them. This could be a massive lawsuit, could it not? Jonathan, what's at stake here?
I think at stake is a potential redoing of all of the alcohol regulation in the US. I mean, it's challenging law. It is going into a space that has few legal precedents in recent years, and whatever the outcome is, there's now going to be recent legal precedents going one way or the other. So it's either going to reaffirm the quasi monopoly of the wholesalers in the US, or it's going to radically break up the market and potentially destroy the entire three-tier system once and for all. So, but it's certainly going to be a milestone case.
Do you have any hopes?
Well, we're used to operating in countries around the world that have far less regulation than the US. I think that it's virtually, for many other markets, you're able to come in, like Italian producers are able to sell into Germany without a German importer. They might have better sales if they have a local importer or a local distributor, but there's certainly nothing preventing them from coming in and selling. In the US, all of that stops at the front door. You can't easily, as an Italian, sell wine into the US market on your own. Dr. Lozen, for example, they've set up a US organization on their own so that they can import the wines and produce in the US, but that's not every business is able to set that up. I think that you could have, I think it's hard to say you can see how people operate and how businesses operate in other markets, and sort of imagine what that could mean in the US. I mean, we're talking to one of our customers who owns large retail chains and markets around the world. One of the people we knew went to their US market and had dreams of building up and modernizing their wine part of the business. And
Shattered dreams.
After a few months in, they realized that their dreams is completely shattered, that in their stores, they can't even touch the wine on the shelves. That the local importer comes, they inspect the shelves, they decide what's going to be stocked on the shelves. They then go to the manager, demand that they pay them up front. They take that money, then they go bring the drinks back, and then they put it on the shelf. This is a completely foreign concept to most people around the world. And it means that from a wine retail perspective, they have little incentive to do any sort of marketing. There's no way for them to improve pricing or do innovative things or get volume discounts because everything is so regulated. So they can maybe deal with fractions of a percent, whereas in Europe, they're used to dealing with like 5 to 10%, fluctuations if they do a good job in executing a campaign or bringing new product in. Now, whether that's actually going to, if the lawsuit's successful, is that going to be one of the potential, is it going to be the outcome versus the flexibility? Who knows? But it would certainly, if that's the outcome, it's going to be groundbreaking.
Yeah.
The world's going to change super, super quick. And
call me a cynic.
Sorry?
Call me a cynic. I doubt.
Yeah.
I doubt it's going to end up being settled like 90% of lawsuits.
Oh, really?
And look, it's unfortunate because I really agree with you when you say that regulations is so stringent and so tight in the US, so tricky and complex to navigate that it prevents innovation. Mm-hmm. Right, and that is a real challenge. Look, on the flip side, what I find this lawsuit as being quite interesting is not just on how complex and how hard, but how the incumbents are now moving in the tech.
Yeah,
the incumbents are now saying, "Okay, we can see technology is required in our supply chain, so this technology there, we don't want to use it. We want to build our own." Mm-hmm. That is absolutely fascinating. Look, I'm an absolute believer that the future belongs to, or the future has to be direct from producer. I'm an absolute believer that the future is direct from producer. But ultimately, it's such a huge market in the US that this amount of complexity, this amount of lobbying money, this amount of influence and regulation, and there's some serious dollars invested on both sides.
Yeah. And I think that's also what strikes me is just like those are, like obviously we're talking like Glazer, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and Provi that recently acquired or merged, whatever you want to call it, like 750, right? That's just like, so it's like, it's two, like it's not David versus Goliath, like not totally, like they both have like weight and money to, to push that, because so like I don't know about the settle, like I don't know if we should take bets or something like that, but like it's definitely interesting because it's both big players, an incumbent versus new player, and both with
they're both basically fighting for their lives, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you have this incumbent who was probably already a bit skeptical of 750 before, but they were perceived as a smaller player, probably not quite the threat. And then all of a sudden you have this massive deal go through and they're like, oh, okay, they could come and erode our business over the next few years. And then on the other hand, you have this massive deal that just went through and they're like, oh, one of our revenue streams just stopped. And so they are both highly motivated and like for significant reasons to take this to one conclusion or the end or the other.
And look, it's worth mentioning at a broader, US-based macro level, Provi as a business has also received, they've raised capital, they've received investment from different investors. One of them I know for a fact, Bessemer Ventures. They're definitely, look, all of their investments are very much in line with trying to integrate the entire supply chain. So a lot of delivery, a lot of production software, a lot of so ultimately, there is definitely a seriously fragmented and dysfunctional supply chain in the world of alcohol and food generally in the US. And there's a lot of money being invested towards trying to fix that, trying to change that, trying to capitalize on it. Whether Provi being sued by the other guys is going to change anything, I don't think so. Total cynic.
All right, Laurie, let's move on to wine fraud. We had another podcast before talking a lot about wine fraud, and there is new technology in the market. Estación Enológica de Haro, a public and governmental laboratory in Spain's major wine growing region, La Rioja, has introduced Brunker's Biospins nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy analysis.
It looks like we're in like a comic book, like, adamantium something, like Marvel, like the Avengers are coming with like a new metal.
So we talked a lot about, tracking the supply chain, this, that, and that. Is this maybe the way to tackle wine fraud? If this works, that they could just analyze the wine and tell you whether it's the right thing or not?
I mean, I'm no scientist, so I can't say, but like, it looks like very like interesting like approach. It's just like something that a collaborator not here on the podcast today would be able to like speak more about. But it's just interesting that it comes from Spain. Personally, like it's a market that we don't hear that often of, like, so that I appreciate that. And also like the fact that it's the Rioja region, which, if we go back to fraud way back, recall how all the Rioja bottles, so you have like the cage, like the netting around the bottle, which was an invention, I don't know if it's 100 years old or something like that, to help protect already the liquid in the bottle. And I really kind of appreciated how history is not repeating itself, but evolving. Like they are the one coming up with a solution again to protect the liquid in the bottle in a more, less obvious way than it is the gilded cage around it. Mm-hmm. Seb, what do you think? Is this a future? Is it how?
Look, it's a fascinating topic because there is a significant amount of fraud, right? It's been established as a good amount of fraud in the industry. I'm still questioning how much do consumers really care. Collectors do. How much do the general consumer and the general consumption of wine in the industry really care? That's one thing. And the other thing is, look, reading about this magnetic resonance thing, they do need to first fingerprint the product. They need to have a genuine sample to compare it to. And so ultimately, you're basically saying, look, this is not applicable to most producers on the planet. They will not send their wine for them to be fingerprinted just for the sake of it. And so how much is that really going to prevent fraud moving forward? Look, it's a cool little tech. I don't think it's going to be an absolute groundbreaker eliminator of fraud in the industry. On the flip side, look, there was a number of blockchain for wine things which were discussed. I'm fairly interested in the movement of fake news and Web 3.0 and having the authenticity of a piece of data to be confirmed, to be verified. And I think that is far more likely to have a significant impact in the world of wine. So that when you buy a bottle and someone is telling you this is what's in this bottle and I'm signing for it because I know exactly where it came from. Ultimately, this is far more likely to have a broader adoption and a broader sort of improvement or end result on fraud, I think. more than the Bluetooth widgets and the chemical signatures, and and we know that the drink is crazy complex in terms of molecules. So until about 5 years ago, we thought it's impossible to mix two things and have a third thing. Well, now we know you can pretty much copy wine, right? Make it up, and it tastes okay. So yeah, I think the drink is crazy complex. So for us to be able to have a one fits all kind of a solution, I'm not convinced.
I think it depends on how this technology is implemented, because in some ways this is the most realistic approach that we've discussed on this podcast towards targeting widespread fraud, not fine wine, but more broad, like general market fraud. And one of the reasons that I think that this can have a role to play, maybe not in how they're doing it necessarily, but and I think I've told the story a few times that Jacques Wine Depot in Germany, discussion with them years ago, it sticks with me that every new shipment of wine they get from the winery, they test against the original wines that they contracted to buy, and they have found quality issues, and then have discovered also that the wine was resold to somebody else down the street, and they were able to detect that in this case it wasn't necessarily explicitly fraud, but it was a defective wine that somebody didn't want to take back, or that's one way of also explaining fraud, that it was just a defective wine, right? But I think when you have somebody who's able to do that at scale, they're not going to test every single bottle, but they are going to spot check a pallet.
Yeah.
And so you are going to catch those individual. You're going to be able to pinpoint that a little bit more. It's more difficult to get through, and so. Going back, this kind of ties back to what you're saying, Seven, about you think that D2C is the way of the future. This only works when there is a good blend of non-D2C as well, because you're going to want somebody in the local market who has a reputation on the line, like that wants to be, Jacques is one of the largest just wine shops in Germany, and they want to have a good reputation for their wine, and they're able to spend money to keep that reputation or invest in that reputation. And the volumes are big enough that financially it can make sense to do these spot checks, which at small volumes, it's not going to be quite the same. So it's interesting, but it's one of the more realistic options to combat mass market fraud.
Yeah, and look, there's a financial question, right? In the mass produced wines, I think we talked in a previous episode. We talked about Yellowtail being copied, and ultimately, if Yellowtail was copied 5% of the time, it was a fake Yellowtail. At the value price point of that bottle, what is this problem really worth fixing? Is this really financially worthwhile as a problem to fix? I don't know. I agree. Look, in terms of quality control, 100%. Interesting topic. Very interesting topic.
And it always has to be, I think, also for the anti-fraud, there always has to be that some neutral party or a third party involved. So it's even though you have trust in this producer, like there's entire businesses that make their business out of just being the third party, right? They
and look, I think moving forward,
companies are in some way the same thing. It's a third party commenting on the product that have enough people believing in what they're doing that they're able to build a business model out of it.
Yeah. Look, it's a very interesting. Oh, am I still on? Oh, I've kind of lost my audio here. I think it's just very interesting because ultimately the the comment in the middle, or the point of trust in the middle, is probably ultimately what technology will get rid of, right? Because technology will be able to tell you wherever your wine came from, whoever made your wine. It doesn't matter what you're telling me in the middle. As a consumer, as a retailer buying a batch, I know exactly where it came from and what went inside of it, and it's certified and it's traceable, and it's so that middle point. I think Jonathan, what you're suggesting is that there's a level of marketing and sales commentary in the middle which has value, but to have a retailer to say, you, my customer, can trust everything in this shop, I think this is becoming irrelevant, because consumers will soon be scanning a QR code, and they'll have a full chain, a full traceability, a full history. And if it says it's organic, and for any reason that producer has been banned as organic or biodynamic, the consumer just won't buy again. So the market will wean itself off of bad actors. You know what I mean? I think.
Well, we had a merger in the direct-to-consumer space or software space. Commerce 7 added VineSpring, and its 560 plus clients. Seb, you are the CEO, leader, founder of one of the most advanced direct-to-consumer platforms for wineries. I know that you must have lots of thoughts on this, so we're going to go to you first. What do you think?
Look, it's interesting. I know, look, it's a small industry, right? Everyone in the world of wine tech, we all know each other. I know the founders of every single other business effectively. And it's really interesting because at least we're seeing interest in trying to standardize on technology. We're seeing that. So Andrew, Commerce 7, they're very keen on trying to have their tech to be used in different places. The one challenge I see as part of this is that ultimately, as a consumer, and we're not talking about the producer, we're talking about the winery, the number of options are running very, very low, right? So we have, I kind of see the industry as having two broad categories of technologies: old technologies and new technologies. And the old boys, look, where you had to install it. I'm not going to name anyone, but there's a bunch of really old tech that were built in the 90s, 2000, 2010s kind of thing. Just forget about those guys. Moving forward, the new technologies, the number of options are now going down. So the producers are basically going to have one out of a handful of options, which I don't see as being very good for the producer. But at the same time, look, I mean, there's no doubt as a market penetration, Commerce 7 is trying to have. They're moving really fast. They're very savvy in the industry, right? They're very good in identifying opportunities, and they're just trying to just own the entire market. As simple as that. Same as we mentioned the incumbents in distribution. So we talked about Grazier and Provi. I have no doubt that the incumbents will fight back. I have no doubt that as much as Commerce 7 is trying to own a large chunk of the market, everyone else is going to sadly play catch up, but they're going to play catch up hard, and they've got capital, and they've also got significant customer base. Right, so Commerce 7 is still only just, I think it's 7% market penetration. It's still nothing in the scheme of things. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it's just kind of interesting because it's an argument of, again, consolidation, so that it's like less fragmented as an industry. Like you can imagine like having less players should technically simplify the communication in between like different silos, or also be exactly the opposite. Like the more you have this like bigger tentpole, like you can just like protect and be like, well, just like we've seen with the lawsuit, like it's Antitrust, like it's just maybe it's just like we don't need to talk to anyone. We're big enough to just like impose what's coming. Commerce 7 is just not there, and I think Commerce 7 as well is still like in some like North American market, like South Africa, like sometimes we tend to forget as well. There's the world. I mean, most of the world is producing some alcohol in some shape or form. So there's just like such a potential. Personally, I was a little bit surprised. Like it didn't seem like a big number, the 560. They've been around like on the VineSpring.
VineSpring, it's interesting because VineSpring, the owner is a winemaker. And from what I know, I spoke to him a couple of years ago, and his priority was making wine. And I think from what I read, he's managed to sort of build a pretty decent support team.
Yeah.
Which, Commerce 7 is basically saying our support is going to be better because we just bought them. Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
But the whole point is they were not a technology play.
Got it.
He was making wine and just happened to make a piece of software, and VineSpring basically owns their region. They have every single one, just about.
Mm-hmm.
But outside, VineSpring, okay. I'm pretty confident saying VineSpring doesn't have anyone in Australia or in South Africa or in Italy. Or very unlikely.
Gotcha. You don't know
and
the
look,
backstory.
all these numbers I'm seeing, Commerce 7 is publicly saying they're now bigger than Wine Direct. And VineSpring saying 500 customers. When you look at overall numbers in the US and the number of wineries in that region, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know what to believe.
Like I have a problem with the math. I mean, this is not my battle to pick. Like it doesn't matter, but like it doesn't seem to add up. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. But look, overall, as I was saying, I think it's good that we're going to have a slightly more. They're trying to standardize the technology. Great. I don't want to speak ill of Commerce 7 and Andrew, but I think everyone in the industry who's worked with him know how he operates. And I've seen a few disasters stories in the world of food, right, where consolidation happened and then prices went up threefolds. And again, the producer ended up footing the bill. And from my perspective, it's really where things need to fundamentally shift. The entire supply chain, everyone selling software, everyone is trying to squeeze the producer at the other end. That's not my attitude. I think this is just fundamentally wrong. You know what I mean? And I've seen too many horror stories.
But it is going back to like podcasts we talked about a few years ago, and just more, or not years ago, a few months ago. Talking about in like the financial situation in the wine tech industry and looking at the investments the past 2 years, I think that whether like how, regardless of how somebody might feel about like also this particular acquisition, it's contributing to just the number of transactions that are happening in general in the wine tech space. And so it's good to see businesses and money changing hands. It gives investors confidence that they're, you're not just going to, investing in a wine tech company is not a hobby. It's not a hobby investment, but it's actually a serious investment because there is a path to get money out, and money is, there is transactions taking place. So I think it's good to see that transactions are continuing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I mean, it's worth saying it's still very, very, very small, right? So the wine tech amount of investments in the US versus food tech versus entire investment sort of venture capital kind of a scene, it's still minute. But I absolutely agree with you. It's a massive shift forward in the last 12-18 months. Wine startups or wine-driven technologies are now seeing some amount of capital support. Yeah.
Well, that was episode 28 of the Wine Tech Insiders podcast. I'd like to thank all of our insiders, Seb from Troly, Jonathan from Bottlebooks, and Laurie from Oushinery. See you all again in a few weeks.
Thanks,
well
everyone.
done, guys. Ciao.